And now, please welcome Vilas Dhar, President, Patrick J. McGovern Foundation; Abigail E. Disney, filmmaker, writer, philanthropist, and activist; and moderator Brendan Vaughn, editor-in-chief, Fast Company.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Brendan Vaughn, as you just heard. I'm very excited to be here with Abigail and Vilas to have this conversation this morning. Congratulations to everybody who won the award, the solvers in the room. That was an amazing moment that we just watched backstage of everybody hearing the news. Very, very moving and beautiful. I want to start off with a question for Abigail that has absolutely nothing to do with what we're here to talk about today, but that everybody probably wants to know, which is, what does a member of the Disney family think of Bob Iger's decision regarding the Jimmy Kimmel show? Please, let's hear.
To be clear, I did not ask to be asked this question. When a company succumbs to a totalist approach to the profit motive, there's nothing left in the guts of the place. And so gutlessly, they succumbed at Disney to a little tiny push. It wasn't even that big a push. They could have pushed back. They had legal standing to push back, of course, and they chose not to. But if you look back and you remember the hoopla around Disney World, 5 or 6 years ago under Ron DeSantis when they came out, they also folded like a cheap suit. So that is the problem. And it's related to what we're going to talk about.
Actually, it's not totally unrelated, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because companies are way too wedded entirely and solely to the profit motive. And that is what's happened to Disney, is it's really hollowed out inside.
Yeah. Radical candor, we've come to expect it from Abigail. Thank you for the answer. So let's actually stick with you here and have you talk just for a minute more, expanding on what you just said, or however you'd like to answer, of course. But we live in this time with radical political realignment, the rise of authoritarian governments around the world, climate. Retreat from a lot of the things that, the kind of moment of like the Paris Accord just feels like very much a thing of the past in terms of just like the vibes right now around the world. We've got, meanwhile, AI rising, generative AI, able to do these incredible things. Just from your perspective as somebody who's been doing this for a while now, looking at the relationship between poverty, technology, power, social tension. When you look out at the world right now, what do you see? What feels distinct about right now to you?
Everything feels distinct. A lot of people I know call it polycrisis, and I think that's pretty much the only word that encapsulates the challenges we're up against. 35 years ago, I started in philanthropy, and there was a lot of talk of low-income people and crisis and rising authoritarianism. What I've seen happen in 35 years is that none of those problems have gotten better. In fact, they've gotten worse. But everyone around me in those rooms full of philanthropists has gotten much richer. How did that happen? What were we missing? And I would argue part of what we were missing was that pretty much every CEO in America came to maturity and power in an age when Milton Friedman and the neoliberals had taught them that there was a social good in achieving shareholder value. That was the ethical thing to do, was go for shareholder value above everything else, and that would create the best possible outcome for the most possible people. So, okay, that's incorrect, as it turns out, and yet we're having difficulty getting CEOs and boards, and generally the C-suite class, to recognize that a pivot is required. There is an enormous pivot required. First of all, there are certain things that just shouldn't be for profit. Prisons and hospitals feel like the two first ones. Yeah, and we've seen how destructive the algorithms can be. in social media. We're living in the wasteland of it. There was a really good piece, I think it was in the Times, about the Charlie Kirk shooter saying, yeah, his motive was really clear if everything we know about the internet isn't true. And the mainstream media missed the story about how, he was living on lulls. And this was, in many ways, an attempt at a massive troll. So we need to find a way to talk to the people who are in charge of our children's minds about something other than the pure profit motive, about something bigger and more lasting, which is all that you have to offer the world, other than lulls. And there are good people in technology, and very often the leaders sound so good at the start. So we need to put our heads together and figure out how to lure them into staying the way they sound at the beginning.
Vilas, before a question for you, anything from Abigail's answer that
I want to follow up, please. Thank you. And thank you, Abigail, for the clarity of that. I want to take this last point, and I want to name this idea that there's a really significant difference that sometimes feels too subtle between two modes of operating. One is to observe the world we have today, to understand why it's flawed, to critique it, and to be angry about it. And that, I think, is something that maybe many of us feel is part of how we're operating today as we look at what's happening around us. But there's a second approach that takes that and evolves it into something bigger. To have a vision of transformation that says, just because the world is this way doesn't mean it has to be that way. That there is something to be done with moral clarity and courage that requires from us more than observation. It requires the fight. It requires us to lean in and participate and to build together. And in this moment, I think sometimes that feels farther away than it ever has in my life. The idea that that fight can be successful. But that's the only thing that changes systems, is the conviction and commitment of every person in this room and around the world to say, we recognize that the inequality we live in the world today wasn't inevitable. It was a set of choices made to advance a structure of power and political ideology. And we have a capacity today to make a different choice. To build a mechanism where our society makes that choice together is, I think, the work of the moment.
Yeah.
Amen. Amen.
Yeah. It is a monumental challenge, but so is everything worth doing, right? Yeah. So, I just interviewed the author Jonathan Haidt of The Anxious Generation, who is kind of fighting the good fight for what he calls like the phone, rolling back the phone-based childhood. And some of the things that he has been able to accomplish seemed impossible. Bell-to-bell cell phone bans in New York City school, in New York State schools, and I think 20 other states, seemed like something that would never happen, and now it is. So that's just one small example of the kind of thing that, these inevitable AI-driven and social media-driven and other kind of tech-driven changes, many of which are wonderful. These things have done great things for the world, but some of the things that they've done for the world, not so great. So on that front, Vilas, I wanted to stick with you and ask you about, intentionally shepherding the emergence of sort of new institutions that can come in through AI's disruptive potential. How do we ensure that happens in a way that creates more equity and doesn't exacerbate sort of existing inequalities? AI was the original framing of this question. We talked backstage that in the last 6 months or so, you've been spending less time talking about AI. Ironic. I'd love to hear actually more about that, and the room probably would too. But if you could take that question from whatever lens you want.
Wow, that's a great question. Thank you. Well, look, you've said some of my favorite words in that question, right? How do we build an equitable world? How do we build it through participation and through institutions? So let me take a frame on this that I think we've already alluded to a little bit. The cliche is that AI will create some form of abundance where all of the challenges we've ever had will maybe just go away. It's comical for me to say that. I've sat at the UN in front of world leaders as a leading tech CEO, somebody who's familiar to everybody in this room sat next to me and said something along the lines of, don't worry, in 5 to 10 years, the work you do with human rights won't matter because we will have created solutions for it using AI. And I couldn't sit there with a straight face. Yeah. Let's take a different frame on this.
Can I ask how often you do hear that kind of thing?
Oh.
Like, it must be infuriating.
It is infuriating, but more than that, I think it brings us back to a core conception of, have we just lost sight of what our humanity is? And let me talk about this through a couple of lenses. The first is, I am as much of a proponent for innovation as I think anybody in this room. I believe the things that we can do when we bring human creativity and insight to technology transform the world around us, and we've all lived it. I think that's exceptional, and we should never minimize it. But to me, the foundational question is, if all we do is innovate technology, and we don't innovate our human institutions, our societal norms, our quest for justice, if we don't come up with new ways to advance the kind of society we want to build, of what use is building new tools and new technologies and new platforms? What have we accomplished if all we do is the bigger model, the better model, more compute, more data, more talent, we'll hire more people, we'll spend more money, we'll suck down more power, we'll waste more water, we'll build an AI-enabled world? For what purpose? If we don't use those tools to inspire new forms of creativity, to make sure that every person on the planet has a chance at economic dignity, to know that they have a pathway not just to an education, because it teaches them skills, but a process of forming a sense of who they are and what they want to advocate for in this world. Now, every time in human history that we've had these massive, incredible transformations, sometimes driven by technology and sometimes by social structure, we've also had a response from human society, which is after we get over the flash whiz bang of this amazing new thing we can do, whether that's the plow or the steam engine or an AI tool, we come back to a foundational question. We ask, who's this going to be good for? Who will participate? Who will own? Who will create? I'm not going to tell you that we've done very well in answering those questions ever before. But if we say that at least in that world where we had to figure it out, we built new structures to deal with scarcity, my question is, how will we build structures that deal with abundance? Let's take technologists at their face value. Let's assume that AI will create a world where we don't have to worry about how we distribute scarce resources. What we so rarely talk about is how will we build a society on top of that that actually supports every person? Because if we say we're going to take today's model and apply it to that world, we are lost already. One where we control, we restrict, we apply our intellectual property and our consideration that this is ours and not yours. It doesn't matter what AI will create if we don't understand how to share it. So I've said this to you backstage, I say it often, I think I Benjamin Buttoned my way into AI. 25 years ago, I was building AI systems and talking about how great they would be in the world. And over the years, I've gone from that to coming back to something much more human. How do we build together? How do we govern? How do we share resources? How do we learn to cooperate? How do we bring words like kindness and dignity back into a conversation that's moved as far away as possible from those topics in AI? How do we talk about AI not for technology, but for humanity's sake?
Yeah.
This, I think, is the work ahead of us.
That's the benefit of you working on AI so long ago, is that you kind of went through all that gee whiz part before. Now it's a little bit more sober. We've just got a couple minutes left. Abigail, I don't want to tell you how to answer or what tone to answer in, but where do you see hope in this? Like, what gives you, when you look out at the world and you see all the things that are changing, where do you see that's something that is moving in the right direction?
Yeah. I was funding a lot in New York City around women and women's issues for years and years, and then one day, after many years of that, I found myself in Morocco, sitting with a women's organization outside of Rabat, kind of rural area. And I sat there and I listened to them talk about what they were doing, and they were using the exact same vocabulary the local women in New York City were using for pretty much every challenge they faced, and pretty much the ethos that they wanted to bring to answering those questions. It led me to believe that there's a mycelium, a social mycelium, that's deeper than roots, deeper than anything, that is the way we talk to each other in a world of kindness, in a world of caring about each other's well-being. And so that mycelium needs to be strengthened and empowered and made visible, or known at least. In the United States, almost 10% of workers work at some kind of not-for-profit. Did you know that? Almost 10% of American workers. And what not-for-profits are this scattershot, helter-skelter, totally disorganized sector of everybody working toward hopefully something better. What if we brought those together? What if we coordinated them? What if we gave them the tools to communicate with each other, to get on the same page, to start organizing together? We, for 35 years, as philanthropists, have been funding programs. We need to fund movements. Movements will change this.
Okay, I think that brings us to the conclusion of this first session. Abigail Disney, Vilas, Dhar, thank you very, very much.
Brendan.